Racist woman refuses black doctor's help. What happens next will shock you. When a life-threatening emergency brings Mrs. Anderson, a 50-year-old woman set in her ways, to the hospital, she's faced with a doctor she never expected. Dr. Paulina, a highly skilled black surgeon. But instead of gratitude, Mrs. Anderson reacts with hatred, refusing to be treated by her because of her race. As her life hangs in the balance, Mrs. Anderson must confront the deep-rooted prejudices that have defined her for years. Will she let go of her bitterness before it's too late? This powerful story of transformation, forgiveness, and redemption will leave you speechless. Watch to find out how one moment can change everything. If this is your first time here on our channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our amazing stories. Now, let's jump into the full story. Mrs. Anderson sat in the back seat of her luxury sedan, chatting on the phone with her assistant about an upcoming business deal. She prided herself on her successful career, her pristine social image, and the control she had over every aspect of her life. But on this particular day, things took a turn for the worse. It started with a sudden itch in her throat, a discomfort she thought was due to the unusually spicy lunch she'd had earlier. She brushed it off, continuing her conversation. But as her breathing became more labored, she realized something was terribly wrong. The allergic reaction came swiftly, far more intense than any she'd experienced before. Panic set in as her throat began to close, her breathing reduced to shallow gasps. Her assistant, hearing her struggle on the other end, quickly dialed 911, and within minutes, an ambulance was on its way. By the time the paramedics arrived, Mrs. Anderson was barely conscious, her face swollen, and her breathing dangerously restricted. The paramedics worked quickly, administering oxygen and prepping her for the rush to the nearest hospital. Mrs. Anderson was slipping in and out of consciousness as the ambulance sped down the road. She caught fragments of the paramedics' conversation, her mind too clouded to fully comprehend their words. All she knew was that she was in grave danger. As the ambulance pulled into the emergency room entrance, Mrs. Anderson was transferred onto a stretcher and wheeled into the hospital. The lights overhead blurred as she was pushed down the hallway, the sounds of beeping machines and hurried footsteps echoing around her. The severity of her allergic reaction demanded immediate medical attention, and the ER team was already preparing for her arrival. Dr. Paulina stood at the nurse's station, reviewing the chart of a previous patient when the call came in about Mrs. Anderson. She was the hospital's leading trauma surgeon, known for her calm demeanor and unmatched expertise in life-threatening situations. The urgency of the paramedics' report signaled that this was no ordinary case, and Dr. Paulina swiftly moved into action. As the stretcher rolled into the emergency room, Dr. Paulina immediately began assessing the situation. Mrs. Anderson was pale, her face swollen beyond recognition, and her breathing dangerously labored. The medical team gathered around as Dr. Paulina issued commands, her voice steady and authoritative. They needed to stabilize her quickly if they were going to save her life. The team worked with precision, following Dr. Paulina's lead. She injected the necessary medication to reduce the swelling and instructed the nurses to prepare for intubation if Mrs. Anderson's condition didn't improve. Time was of the essence, and every second counted. Mrs. Anderson, barely conscious, opened her eyes briefly as she was being treated. She caught a glimpse of Dr. Paulina, standing over her with a calm yet focused expression. In her foggy state of mind, Mrs. Anderson's ingrained biases stirred. She saw not the competent doctor working to save her life, but the color of Dr. Paulina's skin, and an ugly thought crept into her mind. But she was too weak to speak, her body shutting down from the allergic reaction. Hours later, Mrs. Anderson regained consciousness in a hospital room. Her breathing was still shallow, but the swelling in her face had gone down significantly. She felt groggy and disoriented, the beeping of the machines around her making it hard to focus. Slowly, memories of the ambulance ride and the emergency room came flooding back. And then, the memory of the black doctor surfaced. Mrs. Anderson's heart raced with indignation. The mere thought of someone like Dr. Paulina touching her filled her with rage, despite the fact that it was this very doctor who had saved her life. Mrs. Anderson had never been subtle about her biases, and she wasn't about to start now. When a nurse entered the room to check her vitals, Mrs. Anderson's face twisted into a frown. Who was that doctor? Mrs. Anderson croaked, her voice still weak from the ordeal. The nurse, a young woman with a pleasant smile, glanced at Mrs. Anderson's chart. That was Dr. Paulina, our head trauma surgeon. She's the best we have, and she's the one who saved your life. Mrs. Anderson's lips tightened into a thin line. I want another doctor, she muttered. I won't be treated by someone like her. The nurse looked taken aback for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. Dr. Paulina is the best in the field, ma'am. You're in very capable hands. Mrs. Anderson shook her head vehemently, her temper rising despite her weakened state. I would rather die than let that woman touch me again. Dr. Paulina stood outside Mrs. Anderson's room, reviewing the latest test results and monitoring her recovery. She had dealt with difficult patients before, but something about Mrs. Anderson's case left her feeling uneasy. The woman had been unconscious for most of the time she was under Dr. Paulina's care, but the brief glimpse of resentment she had seen in Mrs. Anderson's eyes had been unmistakable. As a black woman in a predominantly white medical field, Dr. Paulina was no stranger to prejudice. She had encountered subtle microaggressions throughout her career, from patients questioning her credentials to colleagues undermining her authority. But she had never let it stop her. Her focus had always been on saving lives, and that was all that mattered. When she walked into Mrs. Anderson's room to check on her, the tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Anderson glared at her, her lips pressed into a tight line. I want another doctor, Mrs. Anderson demanded before Dr. Paulina could even speak. I won't be treated by you. Dr. Paulina remained calm, though the sting of the words wasn't lost on her. I understand this situation is difficult, Mrs. Anderson, but my only concern is your health. You had a very severe allergic reaction, and it's important that we continue monitoring your recovery. Mrs. Anderson's eyes narrowed. I don't care about your concern. I will not be treated by someone like you. Dr. Paulina met her gaze evenly. I'm the best doctor available for your case, Mrs. Anderson. My job is to save lives, regardless of personal feelings. Mrs. Anderson's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the door opened and her daughter, Claire, walked in. Claire entered the room, immediately sensing the hostility between her mother and the doctor. She had overheard part of the conversation and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. Claire had long known about her mother's deep-seated prejudices, but she had hoped that nearly dying would force Mrs. Anderson to see things differently. Dr. Paulina excused herself, nodding politely at Claire before leaving the room. Claire turned to her mother, her face flushed with frustration. Mom, what are you doing? Claire asked, her voice sharp. Do you realize that Dr. Paulina saved your life? You could have died. Mrs. Anderson's expression hardened. I don't care. I'm not letting that woman treat me. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, exhaling deeply. Mom, this isn't about your feelings anymore. This is about your health. Dr. Paulina is one of the best doctors here, and you should be grateful that she was the one who treated you. You need to let go of this hatred. Mrs. Anderson turned her head away, staring out the window. I can't. I won't. Mom, you almost died, Claire said softly. Please, don't let your hatred be the thing that kills you. Dr. Paulina returned to her office, feeling the weight of the confrontation with Mrs. Anderson. She had long learned to compartmentalize the racism she encountered, focusing solely on her patient's well-being, but something about this case lingered in her mind. Maybe it was the rawness of Mrs. Anderson's outburst, the unabashed way she declared her hatred. Or maybe it was the fact that Dr. Paulina had spent hours fighting to save the life of someone who despised her simply because of the color of her skin. Despite her professionalism, Dr. Paulina couldn't help but feel hurt. It wasn't the first time she had faced racism in her career, but it was rare for it to be so blatant. She had spent years proving herself, rising to the top of her field through hard work and determination. And yet, moments like this reminded her that, to some people, none of that mattered. She sat down at her desk, staring at the files in front of her. Mrs. Anderson's condition was still fragile, and it was clear that she needed further treatment. But now the question lingered in Dr. Paulina's mind. Should she continue to care for someone who didn't want her help? Should she step back and let another doctor take over, as Mrs. Anderson demanded? Her pager beeped, snapping her out of her thoughts. There was no time for personal reflection right now. Another emergency had come in, and Dr. Paulina needed to be in the operating room. But as she scrubbed in and prepared for the next surgery, the dilemma still weighed heavily on her mind. As Dr. Paulina scrubbed in for her next surgery, her mind wrestled with the ethical dilemma presented by Mrs. Anderson. It was against everything she had trained for to turn her back on a patient in need, especially one whose life she had already saved. But this wasn't just a case of professional duty. It was personal, too. Dr. Paulina had faced racism all her life, but rarely did it come in such a venomous, direct form as Mrs. Anderson's. Her focus shifted back to the task at hand. The patient lying on the table needed her, and she couldn't afford to let her mind drift. She performed the surgery with the precision and skill she was known for, compartmentalizing her emotions as she always did in such high-pressure situations. But even after the surgery was successfully completed, Mrs. Anderson's words continued to echo in her mind. Later that evening, as Dr. Paulina sat in her office, reviewing patient charts, she received a call from the hospital's chief of medicine, Dr. Harris. He had been informed of the situation with Mrs. Anderson and wanted to discuss it with her. "I've been made aware of Mrs. Anderson's request for another doctor," Dr. Harris began cautiously. "I wanted to check in with you about how you'd like to proceed. Legally, we can't force you to continue treating her, especially under these circumstances." Dr. Paulina hesitated. She appreciated Dr. Harris's support, but the decision weighed heavily on her. She could hand the case over to another doctor and walk away, but doing so felt like conceding to the ugliness of Mrs. Anderson's prejudice. At the same time, could she continue providing care to someone who not only disrespected her but actively rejected her help based on nothing more than her skin color? "I'll think about it," Dr. Paulina replied finally, her voice steady, though the conflict within her raged. Meanwhile, Claire sat by her mother's bedside, struggling with the shame and anger that Mrs. Anderson's outburst had stirred within her. Claire had spent most of her life trying to reconcile the love she had for her mother with the bigotry she knew simmered beneath Mrs. Anderson's polished surface. Growing up, Claire had seen her mother's racism manifest in subtle ways. Snide remarks about neighbors, a disdain for people of color, but it had never been so overt as it was now. "Mom, why can't you see how wrong this is?" Claire asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "Dr. Paulina saved your life. If it weren't for her, you wouldn't be here right now." Mrs. Anderson glared at her daughter, her face still swollen but her expression stubborn. "I won't apologize for how I feel," she spat. "That woman had no right to touch me." Claire stood, pacing the small hospital room. "She's a doctor, Mom. That's her job, to save people. And you're lucky she's one of the best." "I don't need lectures from you, Claire," Mrs. Anderson snapped. "I'm still your mother, and I won't be spoken to like this. Being my mother doesn't give you the right to be hateful." Claire shot back, her voice breaking. She stopped pacing and faced Mrs. Anderson, her emotions raw. "Do you even realize what this is doing to me? I'm ashamed, Mom. Ashamed that you can be so cruel to someone who did nothing but try to save your life." Mrs. Anderson remained silent, her eyes narrowing as she looked away from her daughter. Claire exhaled sharply, feeling the sting of her mother's obstinance. She had always known her mother harbored these beliefs, but it wasn't until now that Claire truly understood the depth of her mother's hatred, and it hurt. That night, Dr. Paulina sat alone in her modest apartment, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Her mind raced with thoughts about Mrs. Anderson and the implications of what had transpired. She had dealt with racism in her life, both blatant and insidious, but it had never been so intertwined with her duty as a doctor. There was a stark difference between facing prejudice in everyday life and facing it in the emergency room, where life and death decisions had to be made without hesitation. The question that kept plaguing her was whether it was her responsibility to continue treating someone who didn't want her help, who outright rejected her for the color of her skin. Could she maintain the objectivity required to do her job while knowing that Mrs. Anderson would never see her as more than her race? But deep down, Dr. Paulina knew the answer. She had taken an oath to save lives, regardless of who those lives belonged to or how those people viewed her. She wasn't in medicine for recognition or validation. She was there to heal. And despite Mrs. Anderson's hatred, She wouldn't let her prejudices stop her from doing her job. In the morning, Dr. Paulina made her decision. She would continue treating Mrs. Anderson, not for the sake of proving anything, but because it was the right thing to do. The following day, Dr. Paulina returned to the hospital, her decision firmly in place. She walked into Mrs. Anderson's room, her demeanor as professional as ever. Claire was sitting by her mother's bedside, but Mrs. Anderson's eyes were fixed on the wall, her face hard with resentment. "I'll be checking your vitals and reviewing your test results today," Dr. Paulina said calmly as she entered. Mrs. Anderson didn't respond. Her lips pressed into a thin line of defiance. Claire looked at her mother, then at Dr. Paulina, silently pleading for some sign of cooperation. But Mrs. Anderson remained silent, her hatred a palpable force in the room. Dr. Paulina went about her work with practiced efficiency, ignoring the tension. She could feel Mrs. Anderson's disdain like a heavy weight in the air, but she didn't let it affect her performance. After finishing her assessment, she turned to Claire. "Your mother's vitals are stable, but we'll need to monitor her closely over the next few days," Dr. Paulina explained. "Her recovery will take time." Claire nodded, clearly grateful. "Thank you, Dr. Paulina," she said softly, her voice tinged with shame for her mother's behavior. Dr. Paulina gave a brief nod, then turned to leave. As she reached the door, Mrs. Anderson spoke, her voice low but dripping with venom. "I told you I didn't want you treating me." Dr. Paulina paused, her hand on the doorknob. She turned back to face Mrs. Anderson, her expression unreadable. "I'm here to do my job, Mrs. Anderson, whether you want me to or not." With that, she left the room, her resolve stronger than ever. As Dr. Paulina exited the room, silence hung in the air. Claire, sitting beside her mother, stared at her hands, frustration evident in her posture. Mrs. Anderson, still fuming, refused to acknowledge the tension between them, her eyes fixed on the sterile white hospital walls. Claire had had enough. "Mom, this has to stop," Claire said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You can't keep treating people like this, especially the ones trying to save your life." Mrs. Anderson turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing at her daughter. "Don't tell me how to feel, Claire," she snapped. "I don't need a lecture from you about how I live my life." Claire's face flushed with anger. "You almost died," she cried. "Dr. Paulina saved you, and you can't even be grateful for that? You're too stuck in your hatred to see the truth." Mrs. Anderson's lips tightened, and for a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken resentment and frustration. Claire had always known her mother was set in her ways, but she had hoped that this near-death experience would change something, force her to see the world differently. But Mrs. Anderson's bigotry seemed more immovable than ever. "I don't expect you to understand, Claire," Mrs. Anderson finally said, her voice cold. "You've always been too soft." Claire recoiled as if struck, her heart sinking. "Is that what you think?" she asked softly. "That I'm soft because I don't hate people the way you do?" Mrs. Anderson didn't respond, and Claire knew there was no point in continuing. She stood up, gathering her belongings, her hands trembling with emotion. "I love you, Mom, but I can't keep doing this with you. You need to realize that the world isn't like you think it is." Without waiting for a reply, Claire walked out of the room, leaving Mrs. Anderson alone with her bitterness. Claire found herself wandering the halls of the hospital, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. Her mother's hatred, her refusal to change, felt like a heavy burden on Claire's shoulders. She had spent years trying to reason with her mother, to no avail. And now, in a moment where gratitude should have been natural, Mrs. Anderson clung even tighter to her prejudice. Claire needed to clear her head, to make sense of the turmoil inside her. She walked down to the hospital cafeteria, grabbed a coffee, and sat alone at a corner table. Her thoughts drifted to Dr. Paulina, the woman who had shown nothing but professionalism and kindness despite her mother's cruel words. How could someone endure such hatred and still do their job with grace? Claire marveled at Dr. Paulina's strength, her unwavering commitment to her duty. In contrast, Claire felt helpless, as if she had failed not only her mother but herself. She couldn't change Mrs. Anderson's heart, no matter how hard she tried. As Claire sipped her coffee, she realized something important. Changing her mother wasn't her responsibility. Mrs. Anderson's racism was her own burden to bear, but Claire didn't have to carry it with her. She couldn't force her mother to see reason, but she could choose how she responded. With this thought, Claire made a decision. She would reach out to Dr. Paulina, not to apologize for her mother's actions, that wasn't her place, but to express her own gratitude. Claire wanted Dr. Paulina to know that, despite her mother's hatred, her work was valued and appreciated. That evening, Claire found herself standing outside Dr. Paulina's office, feeling a bit nervous. She wasn't sure how to start the conversation, but she knew it was important. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Come in," came Dr. Paulina's calm voice. Claire opened the door and stepped inside. Dr. Paulina looked up from her desk, a hint of surprise in her eyes when she saw who it was. "Claire," she greeted, her tone neutral. "Is everything all right with your mother?" Claire nodded quickly. "Yes, she's stable. I'm not here about that," she stammered. I wanted to thank you." Dr. Paulina raised an eyebrow, her expression curious but guarded. "Thank me?" "For saving my mother's life," Claire continued, her words tumbling out. "I know she hasn't been easy, and I'm so sorry for the things she said." "You didn't deserve any of that." Dr. Paulina listened quietly, her face unreadable. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for a response. After a long pause, Dr. Paulina spoke. "You don't need to apologize for your mother's actions, Claire. Her beliefs are her own." Claire nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "I know, but I still wanted to say it. And I wanted you to know that I appreciate everything you've done. Even if my mom can't admit it, I can." Dr. Paulina smiled faintly, a soft, tired smile. "Thank you, Claire. That means a lot." After Claire's visit, Dr. Paulina sat alone in her office, reflecting on the encounter. Claire's words had touched her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't often that the family members of difficult patients went out of their way to express gratitude, especially when racism was involved. Dr. Paulina had grown used to dealing with patients like Mrs. Anderson, people whose prejudice ran so deep that they couldn't see beyond their own hatred. But Claire's kindness, her willingness to acknowledge the truth, had reminded Dr. Paulina why she had chosen this profession in the first place. It wasn't just about saving lives, it was about making a difference, even if it was just one person at a time. As the evening grew darker, Dr. Paulina made her rounds, checking on her patients, including Mrs. Anderson. The older woman remained cold and unyielding, refusing to acknowledge Dr. Paulina's presence. But Dr. Paulina no longer felt the sting of her words. She had made her choice to continue doing her job, no matter the obstacles. Dr. Paulina knew that Mrs. Anderson might never change, but that wasn't her concern anymore. What mattered was that she had the power to rise above the hatred, to continue healing even when faced with ugliness. And that was enough. Mrs. Anderson sat alone in her hospital room, the weight of silence pressing down on her. It had been hours since Claire had stormed out, leaving her to stew in her bitterness. The ticking of the wall clock filled the void, each second stretching into eternity. Despite the improvement in her physical condition, Mrs. Anderson felt a growing sense of discomfort, an unease that went beyond the walls of the hospital. Her body ached from the allergic reaction, but it was her mind that tormented her the most. She had always prided herself on being firm in her beliefs, never allowing anyone to challenge her worldview. But Claire's words, dripping with anger and disappointment, replayed in her mind, chipping away at her certainty. She tried to push the thoughts aside, telling herself that Claire didn't understand. "She's young, naive," Mrs. Anderson muttered under her breath. "She doesn't know what the world is really like." But deep down, the seed of doubt had already taken root. Was she really right to hold on to this hatred? Or had the world moved on without her? Her thoughts shifted to Dr. Paulina. The woman had been nothing but professional, even in the face of her hostility. Mrs. Anderson had expected a confrontation, a sign of weakness, something that would justify her prejudice. But Dr. Paulina had given her none of that. Instead, she had treated Mrs. Anderson with care and respect, even though Mrs. Anderson had made it clear she despised her. The silence in the room grew oppressive. Mrs. Anderson reached for the nurse call button, but hesitated. What would she even say? That she felt lost? Confused? She wasn't the kind of woman to admit weakness, especially not to someone she viewed as beneath her. Yet here she was, alone with her thoughts, questioning the very beliefs that had shaped her identity for decades. After her conversation with Dr. Paulina, Claire sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, staring at the steering wheel. She had left her mother's room in a rush of anger, but now, with the cool night air seeping through the windows, Claire felt something else, something akin to sadness. For so long, she had tried to reason with her mother, to make her see the world differently. She had hoped that love, logic, or even fear of death would finally crack the hardened shell of bigotry that Mrs. Anderson wore like armor. But her mother had proven to be unyielding, even in the face of her near-death experience. Claire sighed, resting her head on the steering wheel. What more could she do? She had confronted her mother, poured her heart out, and still, nothing had changed. But maybe she had been going about it the wrong way. Maybe it wasn't her job to change her mother's mind. Maybe it was her mother's own burden to bear, and Claire needed to let go of that responsibility. The thought brought Claire a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She couldn't control her mother's actions, but she could control her own. She could choose how she responded, and she could choose to distance herself from the hatred that had poisoned their relationship for so long. It wasn't an easy decision, but Claire knew that, for her own sanity, she had to let go. Her mother would either come around on her own or continue down her path of isolation. Claire wasn't responsible for carrying the weight of that hatred anymore. The next morning, Claire returned to the hospital, feeling lighter but still uncertain about how to approach her mother. She knew their relationship had hit a breaking point, and there was no going back to the way things had been. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was time for a change, no matter how uncomfortable it was. As she approached her mother's room, Claire noticed that the door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside and saw Mrs. Anderson sitting up in bed, staring blankly at the TV mounted on the wall. The room felt cold and sterile, a reflection of the emotional distance between them. "Mom," Claire said softly as she entered the room. Mrs. Anderson didn't look at her, but her grip on the blanket tightened. "What is it?" she asked, her voice edged with defensiveness. "I came to check on you," Claire replied, taking a seat by the bed. "And to talk." Mrs. Anderson finally turned to look at her daughter, her face pinched with exhaustion. "About what? We've already said everything, haven't we?" Claire shook her head. "Not everything. I want to understand, Mom. Why do you feel the way you do?" Mrs. Anderson blinked, caught off guard by the question. She had expected more accusations, not an attempt at understanding. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I don't know," Mrs. Anderson admitted, surprising even herself. "It's just how I was raised. It's what I believe." Claire frowned. "But why? What has hating people like Dr. Paulina ever gotten you? Has it made your life better? Has it brought you happiness?" Mrs. Anderson stared at her daughter, the question sinking deep into her consciousness. She didn't have an answer, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else. The conversation with Claire lingered in Mrs. Anderson's mind long after her daughter left the room. She replayed Claire's questions over and over, trying to come up with justifications for her beliefs, but the truth was painfully clear. She couldn't. Mrs. Anderson had spent her life clinging to ideas that no longer served her, ideas that had only brought her isolation and resentment. She remembered the moment she had first seen Dr. Paulina in the emergency room, the flash of hatred that had flared up inside her. At the time, it had felt so righteous, so justified. But now, with time and distance, that moment felt hollow, like a reflex born out of fear rather than reason. What had Dr. Paulina ever done to her? Nothing, except save her life. Mrs. Anderson closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her prejudice pressing down on her. For the first time in her life, she wondered if she had been wrong. Days passed, and Mrs. Anderson remained in her hospital bed, physically improving but emotionally grappling with a storm of conflicting thoughts. Her body felt stronger, but her mind was heavy with uncertainty, guilt, and a nagging sense of loneliness. The world outside the hospital seemed far away, but inside, her inner world was shifting in ways she had never expected. Claire visited her regularly, but their conversations were more subdued now. Claire no longer tried to force her mother to change, and Mrs. Anderson, for her part, had grown quieter. She was no longer spewing her venomous hatred, but something deeper was happening, a quiet transformation that neither of them fully understood. One evening, as the sun set and bathed the hospital room in a soft orange glow, Mrs. Anderson found herself reflecting on her past. She thought about her life, her strict upbringing, the beliefs instilled in her by her parents, and the societal pressures that had shaped her worldview. For the first time, she began to question whether those beliefs had served her well. She had lived a life fueled by resentment and judgment, but what had it really gotten her? Estrangement from her daughter, a life filled with bitterness, and a moment like this, where the person who had saved her life was someone she had hated for no reason other than her skin color. It was a sobering realization. As the days continued, Mrs. Anderson found herself thinking more and more about Dr. Paulina. The woman had been nothing but professional, even after Mrs. Anderson's vile outbursts. She had performed her duty with grace, ignoring the hatred thrown her way. Mrs. Anderson knew, deep down, that she had been wrong about her. But how could she admit it? How could she, after a lifetime of believing one thing, acknowledge that she had been wrong? It was a daunting thought, but the longer she wrestled with it, the clearer it became. She had to make amends, not just with Claire, but with Dr. Paulina. One afternoon, as Claire sat beside her, reading a magazine, Mrs. Anderson spoke, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Claire?" Claire looked up, surprised by the gentle tone in her mother's voice. "Yes, Mom? I've been thinking about everything," Mrs. Anderson said slowly, as if each word was a weight she had to lift. "And I think I owe Dr. Paulina an apology." Claire's eyes widened in shock. She had never expected to hear those words from her mother, not after everything. "Mom, are you serious?" Mrs. Anderson nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, I've been wrong about a lot of things. I don't know if I can change overnight, but I think I've been holding on to things that don't matter anymore." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, not out of sadness, but out of relief. "Mom, this means so much to me. I'm so proud of you for realizing that." Mrs. Anderson gave a small, sad smile. "I'm not proud of myself, Claire. I've hurt people, but I want to make it right." Later that day, Mrs. Anderson asked one of the nurses to arrange a meeting with Dr. Paulina. It was a small request, but for her, it felt monumental. She didn't know what she would say or how Dr. Paulina would react, but she knew she had to face her. When Dr. Paulina entered the room, Mrs. Anderson's heart pounded in her chest. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed, her expression as calm and professional as ever, though there was a slight hint of curiosity in her eyes. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Anderson?" Dr. Paulina asked, her tone neutral. Mrs. Anderson cleared her throat, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yes, I did. I wanted to say something to you." She paused, her voice faltering. "I've said some horrible things to you. I let my hatred and my ignorance take over, and I disrespected you in ways that were unforgivable." Dr. Paulina listened quietly, not interrupting, allowing Mrs. Anderson to continue. "I was wrong," Mrs. Anderson admitted, her voice trembling. "You didn't deserve any of the things I said. You saved my life, and I treated you with nothing but contempt. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I regret how I treated you." Dr. Paulina remained silent for a moment, taking in Mrs. Anderson's words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you for your apology," she said softly. "I've dealt with situations like this before, but it's rare for someone to come forward and admit they were wrong. I appreciate that you've taken this step." Mrs. Anderson blinked back tears, relieved that Dr. Paulina hadn't dismissed her. "I'm trying to change. I don't know how, but I'm going to try." Dr. Paulina smiled gently. "That's all anyone can ask, Mrs. Anderson. Change isn't easy, but recognizing the need for it is the first step." As Dr. Paulina turned to leave, Mrs. Anderson felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. A peace that came from admitting her mistakes and taking the first step toward making amends. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Anderson continued her recovery, both physically and emotionally. Her relationship with Claire improved as they began to talk more openly, and Mrs. Anderson made a conscious effort to challenge her old prejudices. It wasn't easy. Decades of ingrained beliefs didn't just disappear overnight, but Mrs. Anderson was willing to try. She attended therapy sessions, read books that challenged her worldview, and even had a few more conversations with Dr. Paulina during her checkups. Each interaction was a small step toward growth, but it was a step in the right direction. Claire stood by her side throughout the process, supporting her mother's efforts while also setting boundaries to protect her own well-being. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was healing, and that was enough for both of them. As Mrs. Anderson prepared to leave the hospital, she looked out the window at the bright morning sky, feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't the same woman who had entered the hospital weeks ago, full of hatred and bitterness. She had been given a second chance, both at life and at becoming a better person. And for that, she was truly grateful.